All right, guys, what's going on? Welcome back to the Everything College Football podcast. Today, me and Nick here will be doing our post-round one draft grades for the NFL's 2025 cycle. It was an entertaining night here from Green Bay, and we're here to give our grades on each selection, 1 through 32. And we're going to lightly touch on most of these selections and offer some more in-depth analysis on some of them. So we'll kind of keep this episode a little short today. It won't be too long for you guys. Starting with number one, though, Cam Ward, we all knew this was coming for months now, Nick. We both gave it a B plus here. And I love Cam Ward. I think he's a great, pocket passer of what he was able to do from the pocket downfield, across the field. I mean, he was just such a field general for Miami. The biggest concern is he had a lot of plays where he really got himself into a lot of trouble. And of course, at Miami, he had days to throw the football, and those two things are not going to be happening here at the pros. And I think for the Titans, I mean, you look at who got drafted behind them, guys like Travis Hunter and Abdul Carter. You having to take a quarterback that a lot of people have a second round grade on means that you weren't able to select these generational type talents that are, presumably in this draft. And Nick, I think that's probably the biggest knock on the Titans. I think Cam Ward can be really good for him. How great can he be? It remains to be seen. But that's just a tough situation to be in. They drafted a quarterback a couple years ago, didn't work out, and that costed him a great opportunity here.
Yeah, I think they find themselves in a tough situation here having to draft Cam Ward. You and I both went a B plus. I think that's quite a fair grade here, right? No knock on Cam Ward. I think he's a good prospect, but this is a very weak quarterback class, and there's a couple quarterback needy teams that are going to make overdrafting a quarterback. That we saw that twice in the first round here. We'll talk about that later in this, video. But I think Cam Ward here, it feels like a bit of an overdraft compared to the fact that Travis Hunter and Abdul Carter are there, who are two players that you and I both think very highly of. I think this is a team that's not in a great position in Tennessee right now. I think the offensive line still needs a lot of work. The weapons are not there at all. So I think you're plugging in a quarterback into a bad situation. Cam Ward got plugged into a really good situation at Miami last year, obviously succeeded in that situation. So I think he can certainly develop into a really good quarterback in the NFL. I just think that this is a weak draft class for quarterbacks, and when you kind of need a quarterback, you find yourself pigeonholed in that situation where you feel like you have to take a quarterback at one, and the best option available really isn't that good compared to previous years. It sort of adds for a rough, awkward situation here. So it gets a B plus from us. Certainly no disrespect to Cam Ward. He can turn into a talented player, but just not the greatest first overall pick, if that makes any sense.
The biggest stunner of the night happened early. The Jaguars traded up with Cleveland. There's rumors all day long that they were looking to make a big move, and that's what ended up happening. It really didn't cost them too bad of capital either. Next year's first-round pick, that was going to be a given, and then tomorrow's second-round pick, which is an early selection. So great haul for the Browns, I would say. Who are also able to pick up a nice bull on the interior, Mason Graham. I'd say this is pretty good for both parties, Nick. As a Jags fan, this excites me incredibly. Even as long as a year ago, I told you, man, it would be a dream if we could land this guy. And I didn't think we had a realistic shot of doing it because we were picking number 5, and it was going to take something monumental to get up there and do it. And that's exactly what ended up happening. This new regime in Jacksonville is pretty confident that they're not going to be picking in the top 10 next year, Nick, and that's why they sent that draft pick away. And the roster's, quite frankly, too talented to be picking low, so it's not going to be that bad of a hit for them, I don't think, in the long run. Big stunner here, Nick. I'm incredibly happy. A plus for the Jags, even though it did cost a good bit to go get a guy who is a wide receiver defensive back. Usually you don't give up that type of capital unless you're going after, a quarterback and maybe sometimes a pass rusher. Usually only a quarterback, though. A plus for both of us.
Yeah, I think A plus here, land a unicorn player, such a unique athlete. Travis Hunter obviously won the Heisman for a reason, was a phenomenal player this past season for Colorado here, and this makes a lot of move for the Jags, right? This is a team that I think is in a better position than most people give them credit for, with Trevor Lawrence and the rest of what the team can do. So you give up some capital, you move up a little bit, but you land an absolute superstar, a marketable player, a guy you could put on all the ads down there in Jacksonville, a guy that will sell jerseys and tickets. I think he's a fun player to watch. I think you can play him on both sides of the ball early on, but he probably will develop more into a cornerback as things go on. He'll be really good for that defense. I think the Browns did pretty well. They made out with some solid picks as well. The Browns were in a unique position at number 2, considering they have a lot of question marks, obviously, with their quarterback situation, but their whole roster needs a lot of help. So they move back, get some capital, can really begin a longer rebuild. Makes a lot of sense for me. I think the Browns made out well here, but I don't think what the Jags gave up was too steep either of a price to land a unicorn type talent. Gets an A plus for me. Excited to see what Hunter looks like down at Jags.
And then you have chalk picks in Abdul Carter and Will Campbell going to the Giants and Patriots. That was pretty much expected. A plus there. Looking at 6 through 10, the Raiders snagging Ashton Gianti coming off a historic year at Boise State. This guy is incredibly elusive. I mean, he's just a monster to bring down. I mean, he was tearing apart everyone last year. Typically you don't want to take running backs this early. That's why I'm going to go ahead and go with just an A minus. Gianti is a beast, and the Raiders, they lack star power really in Vegas. and they needed a running back since they let Josh Jacobs go. And this team's still reeling, roster-wise from when they had Mike Mayock. I thought he was great on the NFL Network, but as a GM, Nick, this guy was just abysmal. Pretty much wasted every single pick they had. I do think he did snag Crosby, though. I believe that was him, so I guess credit's due there. But they're still reeling in terms of roster, and they're going to go ahead and try to beef up this offense with a nice running back, Armin Membu. I had him mocked to the Jets, a nice right tackle. They can get him inside the guard as well. People kept saying they didn't see McMillan to the Panthers in mock drafts, and they thought it was a complete stunner. I had him mocked there for weeks, Nick. I don't know what that was about. Kelvin Banks, I love the addition there for the Saints. They didn't overthink this one. They have some needs up front. Banks can play tackle or guard. The biggest one here is kind of shocking. Colston Loveland going before Tyler Warren. For some reason, I gave this one a B, and I think it's because Loveland really is good, and I think that two tight end system could really work for the Bears. Ryan Poles, I think he's a good GM, and I think Ben Johnson's an even better coach. So I'm not going to completely put him on blast, Nick, because this is a really good pass-catching tight end. But going over Tyler Warren's a bit of a shock.
Loveland gets a C plus for me to the Bears. I just don't think it's the greatest pick. I think Warren would have been a better spot pick in that situation there. Loveland's a talented tight end, but I just think it's a bit of a reach here. It doesn't make a whole lot of sense for the Bears. I think could have done a lot more of that pick. I also was a little bit harsh on the Jets, giving them a B minus. I think he's a good tackle coming out of Mizzou, but I just think they could have done a little bit better. And they drafted a tackle last year in the first round on the offensive side of the ball, so I think they could have probably gone defense, maybe tried to change things up a little bit, get a pass catcher for whoever's playing quarterback for them. Looks like Justin Fields this year, so I think that could have been an opportunity to try and do something there. I just don't know if I would have taken an offensive line piece again. I think McMillan could be really good for the Panthers. I understand a lot of their fans wanted to go defense, but they need to get some pass catchers for the young Golden Goose and Bryce Young, who certainly turned the corner and looked really good at the end of last year. So I think adding a guy like McMillan, who's a really good deep ball specialist, really good jump ball specialist as well, he could be really solid for your offense. I think that's a solid add. Janty, obviously a bit of a interesting player at running back. Obviously, you don't normally take a running back in the top 10, but Janty is such a freak of nature, such a talented player. The Raiders might as well try to roll the dice a little bit here. Will be fun to watch him down there in Vegas, certainly. And the Saints, I think they did a good job. They avoided taking a quarterback at 9, which a lot of people thought they might. They ended up getting a tackle in Banks, who sure had a disappointing season at Texas, but he's still a very talented player, very versatile, and could be solid on the offensive line that needs some help.
I mean, this is great competence, I think, from the Panthers front office that people have been waiting on, specifically their fans. Bryce Young, at the end of last year, showed, great promise. So why would you not go ahead and go out there and get him another wide receiver one? So I'm very impressed that Carolina made the right decision there. Looking at 11 through 15, a couple of C pluses to get things started. Mykel Williams, I think the 49ers can certainly develop him. He's a high upside player. At times he, flashed dominance at Georgia. But for the most part, over his career, he's just not consistent at all. Wasn't a producer. Just never really seemed to make a big impact. I know in the SEC title game he did. A couple years ago in that playoff game against Ohio State, he had a big sack. But those just seem to be one or two off plays, Nick. He just doesn't bring that to the table a whole lot. Him going at number 11 is a shock to me. And then Tyler Booker, I think this is a great player. I told you the other day I was watching Caden Proctor film, and Booker kept catching my eye of how good he was performing at left guard. I mean, this is a big need with the retirement of Zach Martin. So I understand Dallas doing it, but I'm sure this is not something the fans wanted to see, Nick. They don't seem to do anything in free agency, which that's totally fine, right? But we need a splash here to bring confidence back to Dallas. This wasn't the splash I was looking for one bit.
This is two moves that are a little bit puzzling to some people. I give them a little bit more credit than you did, but I think I can understand why the fans of both these teams might be upset. For the 49ers, I think they have a really strong roster, so I feel like they could have done a lot of things with this pick, and it would have been fine. Mykel Williams has a ton of potential, but that's all it is right now, potentially. He showed a lot of weaknesses at Georgia at times, struggled in certain situations. When you're betting on a Georgia player, it's normally a good bet, so I can understand why they made this move. That's why I gave it a B here. I think the room to grow and develop is certainly there for him, and this is a team that needs some help on the pass rush, some help on the defensive line. Overall, a talented 49ers roster, so I'm not too mad about that pick. For the Booker pick, I gave it a B minus, right, because I think they could have done more with this pick as well. A bit of a reach here. I think Booker is a great player, right, and that film against LSU is very strong. He was a really good guard, was really solid at the interior for Alabama. He was a big physical blocker, solid in run block and pass block. But the Cowboys, they kind of need to do something a little more flashy here. I think the fans are fed up. The response on social media was certainly not positive to this Tyler Booker move at 12. I think if you were going to make a move on Booker, maybe you would have traded back and drafted him. I think he would have still been available later in the first round. Seems like kind of a mismanagement of assets by Jerry Jones, which has been a theme the last couple of years with him. I feel like the Cowboys could have done better at 12.
Especially since they just drafted Tyler Guyton, who was pretty abysmal last year. He was still a rookie, of course, but the Cowboys needed a pass catcher. They needed run defense help. This doesn't move the needle for him, so unfortunately it's going to get a rough grade. Dolphins getting Kenneth Grant. This was a team you never knew what was going to happen. I don't think anybody mocked a D tackle, but I love Kenneth Grant. This is a physical gap clogger in the middle that can stop the run. The Colts, they didn't have to do anything, Nick, and they got the best pick of the night because they needed a tight end badly, and Tyler Warren's elite. A+ there. Jalen Walker, absolutely love what he brings to the table. He's a great QB spy, can play in the middle, as a off-ball linebacker, or he can be a pass rusher as well. I just love his skill set. A+ for me. Final thoughts on these selections.
Yeah, I think Tyler Warren's the best pick of the draft for the Colts here. They needed a tight end. They get the best tight end in the draft that falls right into their lap. They have to even do anything. I think a lot of people are mocking them potentially trading up to draft Tyler Warren. No, I think this is phenomenal that it fell right to them. The Colts get the player they want. A+ pick for me. Jalen Walker almost got an A+ for me for the Falcons, but I just give it slightly an A because there is just a little bit of question mark of what position he's going to play truly when he gets to the pros. He's going to play outside linebacker. He's going to play edge. What's his versatility going to look like? He's a very versatile player. They need help on the defense. The Falcons made 2 nice defensive moves tonight. I think he's a really strong player, keeping the state of Georgia. Nice move there by the Falcons.
Looking at 16 through 22, I feel like the Bengals badly wanted Walter Nolan because their run defense needs help. Defense across the board needs help, and the Cardinals end up snagging him from their hands. They end up getting Sheuder Stewart. Not the greatest consolation prize, quite frankly, Nick, because this guy just wasn't very productive as a pass rusher. He definitely does well against the run, though, collapsing towards the interior. Has some good speed as well, but I think Sheuder Stewart's just not the pick that they were looking for on this defense. One of those high upside players, I guess, but that one's not great. The Seahawks getting Gray Zabel. I mocked him going there, and this is one that a lot of people didn't, Nick. Using big brain football IQ here compared to some of the guys who in the mainstream media just don't know football really all that well. This is a guy that a lot of people project to play the interior. That's the biggest need for Seattle, so maybe a bit of an overdraft compared to some guys on his big board, but this makes a lot of sense for them. Emeka Egbuka, I think he's a great player. I think he's going to do a lot of good things for Tampa Bay. This wasn't really a need for him. They need defense as well. Jalen McMillan, he was a breakout star for him last year, and I think he'll continue to do so as Mike Evans gets older. Chris Godwin re-signs. This wasn't really a need for the Bucs. The offense is fine, so I don't really understand that one. I give a B- to Jedi Barron because the Broncos, they don't need a need either. I think this could, create a great 1-2 punch in your secondary, though, with him and Patrick Surtain. But if you've seen that run defense in the playoffs, Nick, against the Bills, that would lead you to think they need to go, front 7. They could have looked towards a receiver or a running back as well. So Barron's a good player. I don't think it's the greatest pick for them, though. And then the Steelers, they pass up on a quarterback to go with a run-stopping defensive tackle. And then Murray and Hampton doesn't make a whole lot of sense to me for the Chargers because they had a lot of other needs elsewhere. I think, again, Hampton's a good player, but, just the fit doesn't make a whole lot of sense. But Harbaugh, he loves to run the football, and this guy is a physical back, so maybe it could really work out for him. What are your thoughts on these picks?
Yeah, I think, I'll start with Murray and Hampton towards the back half of this little section here. I think it's a good pick for the Chargers, right? I think he's a back that's really talented. They like to run the ball. I have question marks about whether or not Najee Harris could be a productive runner for this team, so I think it's not the worst move in the world to add a back here. Sure, you probably could have done something a little bit better here, but I think it's a decent move overall. I like this for the Chargers. I think Derek Harmon is really solid for the Steelers. They avoided taking quarterback. Probably will do so at some point later. Maybe we'll trade up and do that at some point in the second round or third round. But they had to run stopper, beef up the defensive line. I think that makes a lot of sense. Jedi Barron, I think he's a really solid corner, one of the better secondary pieces in this draft. I think the Broncos again could have done better, but again I think it's still a really solid pick, a guy that could really be decent for them. Emeka Egbuka, kind of shocking to see him go 19 to the Bucs. Didn't make a whole lot of sense to me. Definitely seems like a move that the Bucs could have made some moves on defense, but still a very talented wide receiver coming from Ohio State, a good pedigree that school has at producing wide receivers. Bit of a questionable move, though, I got to say. I'm not too sure on that one. Gray Zabel, I think he'll be really good for the Seahawks. Had a great, Senior Bowl. Really did well during the draft prospect. North Dakota State is a big, bulky school that produces some solid offensive line pieces. He's a freak of nature, a really good tackle that's versatile, could really work for the Seahawks. I agree with you. I think the Bengals did not want Sheuder Stewart. Just kind of ended up how the chips fell for them. Disappointing if you're a Bengals fan. Not really what you needed there. Doesn't make a whole lot of sense for me. Doesn't work incredible. Just kind of a B, an average pick. And then Walter Nolan, the Cardinals, is an A pick. I think he's a really good player against the run, really solid physical player that will be really good on defensive line that can use some help.
Now we'll move to 23 through 30. We'll get to the Giants selection at the end of this conversation about these other picks, Nick, because obviously people are going to see the grades are pretty, upside down frowny face, I guess is the best way to put it. The Packers getting Matthew Golden. I think they're just tired of waiting for these receivers they have, which is a deep group, to really step up and emerge as better playmakers. Golden brings a lot of speed and playmaking to the table. The Vikings, I would have rather seen them go D-line or, in the secondary. Donovan Jackson, was a really good player. At left guard was a standout. They cooked him to left tackle when everyone got hurt for the Buckeyes, and he was splendid for them, so that's very impressive there. But I'll give it a B because I thought Minnesota could have did better. The Falcons trading back up. Gave up a lot of capital to move back into the first round, but they got James Pierce to pair up with Jalen Walker elite stuff by Atlanta. Raheem Morris, I know, is very happy to beef up that defense, something they've been waiting a long time to do. Pretty easy A-plus for the Ravens. Malachi Starks, they do it every year, Nick. They take the player nobody else wants to take. These guys, their roster makeup is so good that they can draft guys at safety in the first round, centers like Linderbaum, Hamilton, another one of those guys they took in the first round. Positional value doesn't mean a whole lot for the Ravens because the roster is so good. A-plus there. Hamilton can probably be in the box a lot more now. Tyreek Williams, one that sneaks into the first round, not many expected. Their defensive line needs some more help. I think that's a nice run-stopping D-tackle. He's also really good as a pass rusher as well. I like the addition of a cornerback for Buffalo. Those are pretty easy selection all mock draft season long. And the Commanders, Nick, seems like they wasted a pick here with Josh Connerly. We just traded for Laramie Tunsil. Our defense is abysmal. Gave up like 8 rushing touchdowns in the conference title game. So we went ahead and snagged a right tackle. Wasted pick, honestly, for the Commanders. What do you make of these non-Giant selections?
We'll talk about the Packers to start. I agree with you, right? This is a receiving room that has a lot of pieces, but there's just not a lot of pieces that are producing for the Packers. They need to give Love some talent. They go out and draft Golden. The fans seem to love it. That was a great moment with the crowd where he came out and spoke on the mic, and the whole crowd went nuts there. Shout out Green Bay, incredible crowd tonight, like 150,000 people in there watching the draft. Really phenomenal showing from a great town. I was able to catch a game up there last season and was really impressed by that fan base. Cool moment. I think Golden could be good for them. Maybe they could have gotten defense, but you could always address that in the rounds 2 and 3, in my opinion. The Vikings, Donovan Jackson, a bit of a gamble here. I give it a B- because it is a bit of a reach, but a player that is still talented, coming over from a solid program that could be decent for them in the offensive line. I think he's a solid asset overall. The Falcons move back up. They gave him a first-round pick, kind of questionable when you think about it long-term, but overall, I think James Pierce is a really good home wrecker, solid off the edge. A lot of people, the preseason had him in mock drafts being maybe the number 2, 3, or 4th pick overall. They get him at 26, A- for me. Pair him up with their other ad and Walker, really solid 2 SEC stars on the defensive line for them. The Ravens, like you said, they always seem to get the best value. Malachi Starks and Hamilton together would be an incredible duo. Hamilton can play in the box now. You can really move it around. This Ravens team is just loaded here. They're just picking up talent over and over again. A+ easy. Tyreek Williams, I think that's a solid move. What was the biggest problem with the Lions late in the season? Their defensive line was injured. They had so many injuries. They had no depth on their defense in the second half of the season, and it cost them in the playoffs here. Bring in some nice depth. Williams, a player you can work on, a project player you kind of develop and turn him into a star potentially. I like that a lot. I don't really understand the Commanders pick either. Like you said, they need help on defense and grabbing a tackle. I don't really get it. A B- for me. And then the Bills, what was their biggest problem against the Chiefs in the conference title game? Their secondary. They got torched when their top starters got hurt. Their backup piece were getting picked on. Bring in Maxwell Harrison from Kentucky, who I think is a really strong player, a good asset, really good in coverage, really good at attacking the ball, making plays on the ball. A really solid pick. Got to get an A for me.
And now look at number 25. Of course, Nick's a Giants fan, so he went ahead and gave it an F triple minus because he's a little upset with this. And what we're going to talk about, I only gave it a C plus though, because the thing about Jackson Dart is I'm just not buying the hype. But I think this guy has a phenomenal arm. He can really rip the football right. But there was times throughout his college career where he just never seemed to improve. 3 years in Lane Kiffin's system, and he still just wasn't playing that great of ball. It was pretty rare when you saw him just red hot flaming from the pocket. And you should have seen it more often. The Arkansas game, the Duke game are great examples. In 23 against LSU, a couple of examples, right, of him just absolutely flaming opponents. And in conference play, you just didn't see a whole lot of that. It seems like he didn't improve all that well when it comes to his mental makeup of being able to diagnose coverage. It's an RPO scheme. Certainly can be tough at times, but it's also a little bit more QB friendly. I know he protected the ball a good bit, but for the most part, I just didn't see him with that mental makeup. The Florida game, he played quite well in that game for the most part. But that fourth quarter, I know it's hard to judge a prospect on one fourth quarter, Nick. That was just abysmal. He throws a pick, gets overturned, he goes out and does the same thing again, right in the triple coverage with the game on the line. And this is just not a guy I think that's going to end up being all that great. You've seen it against Kentucky and LSU, games on the line, he just doesn't step up. And I think these are proven facts at this point, Nick. And again, I do think he has great arm talent. It only cost the Giants 2 third-round picks, while the Falcons, who picked up right after them, gave up next year's first rounder to trade up. So kind of a steal there, the move up back into the first round. And, so I think the upside is certainly there. And it didn't cost him franchise-altering assets. So I wouldn't be as upset as you are, but I'm going to give you the floor.
Maybe I'm being a bit harsh here, but as a Giants fan, I think I have the right to do so. This pick just doesn't make any sense to me. Yeah, they didn't give up a whole lot of assets, talking about third round picks here, but this just doesn't make any sense. You signed two quarterbacks this offseason, sure. Jameis Winston and Russell Wilson are not the future options in New York, but I don't think Jackson Dart is either. This is a guy that thinks getting so much hype because it's a weak quarterback class. This is a weak quarterback class. There's no sugarcoating it. Cam Ward's not that great of a prospect. Sheuder Sanders didn't get drafted in the first round for a reason, and Jackson Dart's not that good of a prospect. You have quarterback needy teams. Supply and demand is low. Demand is high, supply is low, and things like this happen. The Giants made a move. I figured somebody would make a bad move up back into the first round and draft a quarterback. I was hoping it wasn't my team. Well, I was wrong. They did so. I think his footwork is a mess. I think the system really shelters him at Ole Miss. I don't think it translates well to the pros. I worry about the accuracy. I worry about his ability to make good decisions in big game moments. You saw it over and over again. The film on him just is not impressive. I think in last year's draft class, he would maybe be the 8th, 9th best quarterback in that class. To take him in the first round, I think is a complete waste, really a malpractice in my opinion. I don't think this guy has any future in the NFL. Giving up any sort of tangible assets to do so just makes no sense to me. If you were, gonna make a move like this, you could have waited. You probably could have got him in the second round at pick 34 where the Giants sat. I really don't think the teams in front of them were clamoring to jump up and draft this quarterback right now. Maybe the Browns, but that's about it. I just don't see that being a necessary move. Giving up any sort of draft assets, in my opinion, was a complete mistake here. This makes zero sense to me as a Giants fan. I think they'll look back at this and say, wow, that was a complete blunder. It just was a bad move, in my opinion. Last year's quarterback class, I know it's tough to bet on the future, but next year's quarterback class, that is, I apologize, looks really good. So you could have maybe got a quarterback next year. This team is not competitive right now. They're not going to be competitive next year. And adding Dart just doesn't make any sense for me. Giving up assets for a guy who I think is, like I said, would have been the 8th or 9th best quarterback in the class last year just makes absolutely no sense to me. This is a complete malpractice in my opinion. And Brian Daboll and Joe Schoen will probably be looking for jobs at the end of the year anyway. This is a complete mess from the Giants, and it really comes with the fact they made a great move by drafting Carter at 3rd overall, in my opinion. I don't know what the long-term vision is of the New York Giants. I'm really concerned about the future. If you looked at the first slide, I gave the Carter pick an A instead of an A+ because, the Giants didn't really need help on the edge. There were more needs this team needs. A lot more different positions had to be filled, and they ended up drafting a quarterback and an edge rusher. Just not really working for me. I'm just a little disappointed, I got to say, as a Giants fan.
Yeah, I certainly think he'll be in the league longer than you think. I mean, he can legitimately spin the football, so a lot of raw stuff that they can work with. Looking at the final two picks, the Eagles taking Jahad Campbell. He certainly has some injury concerns. The thing is, the Eagles will be patient with these guys. Campbell's going to come in. You're not going to hear his name for the first 2 years, and then I think he's really going to break on the scene because their roster, that's just kind of how they work. Milton Williams, a good example of a guy who's a nice rotational piece for a couple of years for Philly, and this past year was elite in their run to the Super Bowl, and I think you're going to probably see that from a nice athletic guy who has a lot of speed in Jahad Campbell. And I gave Josh Simmons an A+ because I'd been mocking him to the Chiefs for months, Nick. So I'm going to go ahead and take my my flowers on that one. What do you think of these final two picks between the Super Bowl teams?
Yeah, I also gave Simmons an A+ because it fills a need. The Chiefs do not have a lot of needs. This is a very good roster, obviously, but we saw that tackle was a bit of an issue for them last year. They had some issues, certainly. Left tackle, right tackle had some question marks as well. In general, I think both tackles, could use some potential work for the Chiefs. I think you add a guy like Josh Simmons, who's very versatile, had a really solid career at times. I know he battled some injuries at Ohio State, but still an incredible player overall. And the rich get richer here. I think this is a really good value pick for the Kansas City Chiefs. Jahad Campbell, another good value pick. The Eagles, just like the Ravens, seem to always find a way to get great picks late in the first round. Campbell, yes, there's some injury concerns, but he's a dog, a really good aggressive player from Alabama, a really solid linebacker that's versatile as well. I think they'll find a way to get use out of him in Philadelphia. These two teams were in the Super Bowl for a reason last year because they have really strong constructed rosters, and they're continuing to do so, putting together another two nice pieces here at the end of the first round.
Now we look at the best available heading into day two. Sheuder Sanders still being available is the biggest topic. His dad said his son was going to go top 5 in the draft, and that did not happen, Nick, and there was really not much interest in him at all once he got past Pittsburgh. We figured the only chance would be somebody potentially trading back in, and the team that did that did not take him. So I'm not really sure if this boils down to evaluation or attitude. I think potentially it's a little bit of both. And, Sheuder Sanders could be in for a bit of a slide if he doesn't go early in round 2. The Browns have 2 selections and the Raiders have 1. I think, within the first 5 picks of round 2, if he doesn't go there, Nick, he's probably going to slip a little bit. Will New Orleans take him? Maybe. I don't think the Jets are going to, so I think it's potential for him to slide a great deal here, which would be unfortunate for Sheuder Sanders, but I think the way that, he's kind of handled this whole process has not been ideal. Some of the more elite players that we certainly expected to be taken, Mike Green, Will Johnson, Donovan Izaraku, Darius Alexander. Pretty shocking to still see them on the board, Nick. What do you think is going to happen with those defenders, and when will Sheuder's slide stop?
Yeah, I think Sheuder's slide makes a lot of sense if you followed this process. I wasn't very high on him as a prospect, and I think a lot of people weren't very high on his attitude and some of the other underlying issues with him. ESPN wanted to talk about him all night. It seemed like Mel Kiper couldn't stop talking about him and would refuse to talk about anyone else but Sheuder Sanders. Hey, pump the brakes a little bit, Mel, all right? This is a prospect that has a lot of issues off the field in terms of attitude and is still not super polished, in my opinion, so I'm not entirely surprised at all he slid out of the first round in a weak quarterback class. Probably gets picked by the Browns, I would imagine. Maybe the Saints, maybe the Steelers engineer a trade to go up and draft him. But outside of that, I don't really see a landing spot for him, so it makes a ton of sense he slid, in my opinion. Mike Green and Donovan Ezraku, I think, are two shocking ones. These are two edge rushers that are very talented. I think there were some better edge rushers in this class, but I think you could have seen Ezraku or Green go in the first round. Both these guys coming from smaller schools that I think are really solid prospects that have a lot of room to grow. I think Darius Alexander still being on the board is interesting as well. A really strong prospect, also from a smaller school, who I think could be really good. And then Luther Burden, don't think a lot of people would have had him falling out of the first round when the season started. His stock has seemed to fall a little bit. I think he's still an incredibly talented wide receiver with a lot left in the tank. Curious to see where he ends up.
Plenty of great talent still on the board. Round 2 is going to be phenomenal. And of course, you got guys like Jalen Milroe, who ended up not being talked about at all. Tyler Sheuder rolls up draft boards as of late. Travion Henderson. Judkins, the top running backs there. Cam Scatterbill. This is going to be a fun day 2 and 3 of the draft, Nick. I'm very excited for what's still in store here. I think regarding Sheuder, this is still a very talented player. I think has some good upside. The ability to make plays in a collapsing pocket is very impressive. The downfield accuracy. This is a guy who's showcased a lot of great toughness, so I think you can put him in the NFL. And I think he'll be humbled a little bit, I think, by the coaching staff in the locker room and whatnot. And I think the respect will certainly have to be earned. And I think he'll certainly put up a valiant effort wherever he ends up, which I would like to think is the Browns, Nick. They have 2 picks right there. And you think that's a possibility, or somebody else can take him?
Yeah, I think the Browns make the most sense right about now. I feel like they should with one of the 2 picks they have. If he slides past the Browns, it could be a very long time, like you were alluding to. I think it would make sense for him to go to the Browns right now. I think that the Steelers will probably end up taking Milroe at some point in the second or third round. Like I said, probably trading back up in the second round. I don't think they have a second round pick. I think Sheuder to the Browns could work out. That's a team that's in a really messy spot right now. The Sanders family maybe don't want to go to the Browns. I don't know. There's a lot of loud voices in that family, so questionable there, in my opinion. We'll be curious to see how this all goes. Still a ton of talent left on the board. A lot of really good picks that could be made in the second round. I think this is a really solid draft class in terms of pure depth at some of the positions that are maybe not as super attractive. Some good corners on the board as well that can go in round 2 tomorrow.
Yeah, I think that early in the cycle, Sheuder was mocked to the Browns often. So if you can get him in round 2, that's how you win the draft. So I think that'd be very ideal for them. I think that's going to be ends up happening. Make sure you guys like, comment, subscribe. See you next time.